Hi, welcome to week three. Our first topic of the week is I'm titling Strange Fruit, the Legacies of Racialized Slavery in American Life. And I'm gonna, I think, kind of talk about the elephant in the room, and that's this. Talking about race makes a lot of people want to scream. If you're feeling that way, just know, A, you're not alone. There are people of all kinds of racial backgrounds who feel this way. And particularly, I think right now in America, right, there's a lot of people who are very vocal about their frustration occasionally feeling like they're being forced to talk about things they don't want to talk about. So again, if you're feeling that way, you're not alone.
And in fact, I care so much about what you think about this that I asked you this question on your survey. What do you think about race in the US? Here are the answers I got from most to least popular. 81% of you said my generation could benefit from honest discussions about race. 76.2% of you said race will always be an important issue in this country. 46.7, racism is a founding feature of our nation, so it keeps coming up. So a majority of you are kind of on board and say, yes, I think we should talk about race. It's an important thing. However, the opinions kind of tend to diverge from there. 33% said all lives matter and singling out one group for special treatment is wrong. 3.8%, some make race a big deal even when it isn't. 4.8%, by the way, that was one person. I never think about race. And one person also said talking about race makes me frustrated and angry. Now, I don't know if this is the same person who said both of these things, because again, it's anonymous and I don't try to find out who said what. But I do know that if I were to give this survey nationally, that these numbers down here would be much higher because a large percentage of Americans feel that way. We also had two really interesting write-in votes, so I want to give those time as well. One person said, systemic racism continues to cause issues all in the US. Another person said, I'm always thinking about race. Now, again, I don't know if the same person said both of these. Um, but regardless of your opinions on race, I hope today's discussion will be interesting and helpful and fruitful.
Having said that, here's a little thought experiment. What if, when we study the Constitution, people agree and disagree over it. But generally speaking, if you say, "Hey, we're going to talk about the Constitution," people aren't getting ready to walk out of the room, right? However, when you say, "Hey, let's talk about race," you're immediately going to put certain people on guard, alienate some people, right? And I, when I talk about these issues, I understand that. I try to approach these sensitively and recognize that not everybody wants to talk about this kind of stuff. So, what if we tried to approach race as like a cultural artifact, right? As something we can analyze, express curiosity about, and even try to better understand. Now, again, maybe that's overly optimistic thinking. Maybe that's not possible for all of us. But I hope that if you're one of those people who's feeling frustrated or nervous about approaching this topic, race is a historical fact, and I'm going to try to approach it in that way. One more statement I want to make kind of related to that is that some people, when this topic comes up, I think, to be blunt, particularly white people, feel particularly singled out and attacked. So when I was younger, before I got comfortable talking about these things, I felt that way too for a good chunk of my early life, right? And I want to say this: no one should ever feel guilty about things that aren't their fault. None of us were alive back then, and I don't think anyone should feel guilty about things that we have not personally participated in. However, I do hope that all of us as Americans feel responsible to understand how race shaped and still shapes the world that we live in today. So again, I'm saying all this because my purpose today is not to attack, offend, alienate, make anybody feel bad about anything that about who they are or what they've done or what they've inherited, right? However, I do want to make us all a little uncomfortable, and I think uncomfortable in a productive way because I think there are so many issues today that you can't understand unless you talk about race, and you can't understand race unless you talk about slavery. So that really is my goal today. So here is an overview we're going to talk about. We're going to start with the 1619 project. Sometimes I deal directly with your talkbacks in class, sometimes I don't. Today will be one of those days. So I want to just kind of tease this apart a little bit more. And then we're going to just go into just some vocab. So there are certain words, concepts in regards to race that I'm going to be using. So I just want to define them. And then we're going to look at a really obscure but like extraordinarily important moment in American history, something known as Bacon's Rebellion. Whenever I teach this class in person, I ask students who's heard of this, and like two students raised their hand. But in terms of um, kind of highlighting how race was kind of established as a thing in early America, Bacon's Rebellion is really important. And then we're going to look at two large case studies. We're going to look at basically really surprising ways that slavery and racism shaped American culture, and we're going to look at jazz. Jazz was, I think, directly shaped by this legacy, and I think offers a really good case study in some of the really complex and surprising ways that slavery and race shape things that have, at least like ostensibly on the surface, nothing to do with slavery and race, right? Or at least at first glance. And then we're going to look at something called miscegenation laws, which were basically laws barring interracial marriage, which existed in America for centuries. And kind of like, I'm going to kind of do these two sections together. They could have been one bullet point, but I wanted to separate them. We're going to look at some of the ways that kind of popular movies reflected this debate over interracial sexuality, right? So this is what we're going to look at today. Again, if you're feeling uncomfortable or nervous, I hope, 10, 15 minutes in, I hopefully will have alleviated your anxieties about talking about this. However, at the same time, um, some of this should make us feel comfortable because this is kind of ugly stuff. But again, it's ugly stuff that is important for understanding the world we live in today. So let's start with the 1619 Project. So this is Nicole Hannah-Jones. Nicole Hannah-Jones is a journalist. She's a pretty respected, award-winning journalist. In August 2019, I'm sorry, a journalist who works for the New York Times. In 2019, she, in collaboration with the New York Times, announced something called the 1619 Project. Basically, 1619, 2019, it was roughly 400 years after the first introduction of enslaved Africans to the Virginia colony in the section of North America that would become the United States. And basically, she kind of curated like a series of essays, some by her, some by others, and also like a website with some kind of materials that teachers could use in their classroom and whatnot. Basically, the point of it was to make the argument that the founding of America did not make sense unless we talk about kind of the establishment of slavery, right? That really was the overall goal. However, not everyone was happy about it. So, for example, some people pointed out that the first enslaved Africans arrived in kind of the New World, broadly speaking, much sooner, actually 1526 in like the Caribbean, and that the 1619 project was kind of getting that wrong. Some other people, and these were more kind of like academic historians, just pointed out some just issues and errors in the actual history. Like so, for example, the 1619 project, at least initially when it came out, was making the argument that the colonists who revolted against the British, that for like a significant portion of them, part of their motivation was because they thought the British were going to abolish slavery. So that is true. There was a minority of colonists who believed that. However, some people thought that it was overstating the case and arguing that like slavery was a core component in the American Revolution, which most historians say it, even though it was a small factor, it was not a large component. So again, there were some people who were like professional historians who criticized the 1619 project, and then there were people on the right who also who I think more aggressively criticized it. So again, here's just a random headline from a conservative website. Probably the most notable criticism came from kind of the Trump administration. So the Trump administration announced something called the 1776 Commission, which basically, presidents can put together like advisory boards. They're not making laws or passing legislation. They're just like studying an issue and putting out a report. So you can Google it. The 1776 report was and commission was kind of basically like meant to be like an answer to the 1619 project. And they also, like the 1619 project, they have a website you can go and teachers can use their resources and whatnot, which is basically arguing no, that like 1776 was the state of the United States, not 1619. And, that we should not talk about the negative so much of history. We should talk about liberty and freedom and things like that, right? Um, and additionally, there was another organization called 1776 Unites, which was a nonprofit organization, but it was not government. And that was particularly spearheaded by some Black conservatives, including Bob Woodson, who you see here, who basically felt like things like the 1619 Project were part of what he called the race grievance industry, which is basically like, diversity experts and historians who were basically like making money off of like making Black people angry, in particular, just Americans angry about race and trying to sell books and videos online and stuff like that. I'm going to pause here. I know you already watched two videos about this, but I just wanted to play a quick video from the 1776 Unites organization for them to kind of talk about some of the work that they were doing to kind of counter what they saw as the excesses of the 1619 Project.
In the 60s, the civil rights movement was defined by the rich debate as to the course forward. Unfortunately, today, that rich tradition has been abandoned and the civil rights movement has become an extension of the race grievance industry. As a civil rights veteran myself, I felt compelled to respond and push back against the use of the Black experience as a bludgeon against the country. The 1776 was developed to defend the ideals of the country that defined Black success in the presence of oppression of the past.
2020, a year unlike any in our lifetime. A year when hundreds of thousands of Americans died of a virus that did not exist the year before. A year of massive unemployment, explosive urban protests, and turbulent elections. And a year when the Woodson Center grew its outreach and explored new ways to support low-income communities across the nation. Against this background, the Woodson Center launched 1776 Unites. In February, the Woodson Center gathered a consortium of scholars and activists to respond to the rising tide of racial grievance and historical revisionism by telling the story of Black American resilience and achievement. A year later, the movement is still generating excitement among Americans of all races and backgrounds. Why? 1776 Unites brought together scholars and activists, our nation's thinkers and doers. This allowed the work of our grassroots leaders to inspire and inform the work of our scholars, who were then able to present their stories and solutions to academia, the media, and the policymakers. The Woodson Center also created the 1776 Unites curriculum as an alternative to the racial grievance dogma overtaking countless schools. The curriculum addressed the need for greater instruction in the Black American experience, focusing on inspirational stories of resilience, triumph, and hope that show a clear path forward.
Now, despite some of the concerns and criticisms of the 1619 Project, overall, it has been pretty well received. So much so that in 2013, Hulu released a 6-episode docuseries kind of exploring some of the issues that came up in some of the articles and some of the website, there was a book as well. So basically just kind of like identifying some of the specific issues dealt with through the various 6 iterations of the 1619 Project and doing kind of a docuseries, like a mini documentary 6-episode TV show. I haven't seen it. I don't know if it's good or not. But again, this is just, I think, further evidence that whether you agree with the 1619 Project or not, there are lots of people out there who think it's really, really important to look at the legacy of slavery and try to understand contemporary American life and through the lens of that historical reality.
They say our people were born on the water. The very first enslaved Africans were brought here over 400 years ago. Since then, no part of America's story has been untouched by the legacy of slavery. This is the 1619 Project.
The New York Times
1619 Project.
My father, he always flew a flag in our front yard.
One thing about Dad, he was patriotic.
He was a part of that United States Army. They served their country, but hey, you serve your country don't mean your country gonna serve you.
The truth is, Black Americans have always been foundational to the idea of American freedom.
Democracy is a fight. It will always be a fight.
You are calling for reparations. What is the total that would be owed?
$14 trillion.
That's a big number.
Yeah.
Big debt, though.
It is a big debt.
We are still fighting. As long as there's life, we're gonna have hope.
When I hear fog, I hear freedom.
There are centuries in that music, centuries in that spirit.
The 1619 Project, it's not a history. It really is talking about America today. Black Americans' contributions are undeniable. No people had a greater claim to the American flag than we do.
Now, regardless of where you stand on this issue, here is the argument I'm going to be making today. Although slavery happened a long time ago, right, quote unquote, it set a template for Black-white relations that shape institutions as disparate as popular music to marriage patterns. Right. So my goal today is we're going to look at slavery a bit in early America, look at particularly how slavery shaped ideas about race, and then using two case studies again, the kind of the creation of jazz in the late, I guess, the early 20th century, and this kind of like forgotten history of miscegenation laws, how things that seem like totally disconnected from slavery, right? Music and marriage patterns were shaped by this institution of slavery and racism in ways that are really surprising to I think a lot of modern people. So let's jump in and begin with just some basic vocabulary. Um, so, race. What does the word race mean? Race is a socially constructed system that sorts people into categories based on biological differences. So let me stop there. So socially constructed means that race is not a biological fact, right? You cannot genetically prove that there are Black people and white people and Asian people and and et cetera, et cetera. These are human categories that we come up with to describe and understand biological differences. However, and I think this is really, really, really important, saying that race is socially constructed is not saying that race isn't a real thing, right? Race is a political fact, right? It's a social fact. It is a fact that ideas about race exist. Even if ideas are just socially constructed, they're still ideas, and ideas are powerful, right? Um, and I lost my place. Race is a political fact of U.S. history, which has been used to decide who gets the best and who gets the rest. And this is why we still talk about it, right? It's not just somebody someday was like, hey, let's call these people white and these people Black. It was like, let's call these people white and these people Black, but let's give these people advantages and give these people disadvantages. And this is why we have. This is why some people say we still need to talk about this today, right? Here's just again a quick example from some things we've already seen. When America was building the suburbs in the 1940s through the 1960s, and they made people in some communities and many communities sign housing covenants that basically made them promise that they wouldn't sell their house to a non-white person. Um, you know, it wouldn't make any sense to say, well, this is just socially constructed. Who cares? Well, yes, it is socially constructed. Race is a socially constructed category, but it is a powerful socially constructed category that, at various times in history, has been used to decide who gets resources and who does not, right? So again, saying it's socially constructed is not saying it's not real. It is real because it's a social and political fact of American history, right? So let's further define race. And talk about racism, right? So today when people say racism, one of the reasons why we have such a hard time talking about race and racism is because when different people from different communities say racism, they mean different things, right? And I think generally speaking, if I had to boil it down in the simplest terms, um, today when people talk about racism, there are kind of two senses of that. Sense one is the individualistic sense, in meaning like just individual people or communities exhibiting a set of discriminatory beliefs and behaviors directed at racial others, right? So I'm race A, I don't like people of race B. That's kind of individual racism. And I feel like that's pretty non-controversial. I think everybody agrees with this. However, we do get into more controversial territory because some people think this is complete nonsense. But I would argue that there's also a structural sense to racism, right? Structural racism or systemic racism, as it's called sometimes, is the kind of systemic or systematic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. So, in other words, it's just a fancy way of saying sometimes racism is embedded in social structures, right? So, for example, again, back to the housing covenants, that's a good example of systemic racism, of creating a political, social, economic structure that cut one entire group out, right? Again, few people today would dispute the idea that there are like racist individuals and communities out there, right? I'm about to show you a picture, by the way, of some of the a picture illustrating kind of the recent resurgence of white nationalism. I just want to give you a warning before I show this picture, because again, this stuff is really upsetting to a lot of people, I think, as it should be, right? So again, few people, I don't think anyone, I think even the people in this picture would not disagree with me saying that there are some racist individuals and communities out there, right? That's not controversial. However, when we start talking about systemic or structural racism, that's where you start. This is where people start disagreeing, right? Now, I think systemic racism is a fact, right? Of just to me, it is simply a fact that racism has shaped American social structures. So what I'm going to do is play a little video that's kind of explaining this idea of systemic racism. Again, whether you agree with it or not, it's an important concept to understand because it's a concept that I'm going to be using in this class. And I think again, I to me, and I think this video does a good job of explaining some of the complex ways that systemic racism shapes people's everyday lives.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
Now, again, to be fair, since not everybody believes systemic racism is a real thing, I'm just going to play a really short video from a black conservative guy named Larry Elder, who will be kind of like representing the other side.
What are they going for there?
Well,
what is the goal there?
The goal is to tell black people that we're victims, that discrimination and racism remain major problems in America when in fact they don't. And they want black people to vote for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party gets 95% of the black vote, and the reason they get it is because blacks are convinced that the #1 issue facing the country right now is social justice, racist white cops, discrimination, systemic racism, microaggression, whatever new word they come up with, and it's a bunch of nonsense. The #1 problem domestically facing this country is a breakdown of the family. And President Obama said it, I didn't. A black kid, or kid, not just a black kid, a kid raised without a dad is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crimes, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. So you're far more likely to end up in jail without having a dad than you are because of a white racist cop.
Now, again, regardless of where you stand on this issue, I'm going to keep kind of moving ahead here, and just further define some things. So in academic settings, when people use terms like whiteness and blackness, we're not talking about skin color. Whiteness and blackness are terms used to describe kind of the historical project of defining what it means to be white and black in the U.S. History shows that whiteness and blackness are directly related to struggles over power, resources, and wealth. So let me break that down. So again, if I say whiteness, I'm not talking about white people. I'm talking about the idea of what it means to be white. And again, you're like, why would you do that? Well, I think this will make sense once we get into our case studies, particularly talking about Bacon's Rebellion. The idea of being white didn't exist forever. If you go back, if you took a time machine back to 1650 or 1670 and said, that person's white, that person's black, people would be a little confused because those terms hadn't emerged yet. So again, I'll kind of put a pin in that. We're going to come back to this issue. If you're confused about what I'm talking about, I think once we start talking about Bacon's Rebellion, this will make a little more sense. Let me then define ethnicity. So we're going to talk more about ethnicity when we talk about immigration in a few weeks or a few classes. I'm not sure exactly when that comes up, but ethnicity and race are sometimes used interchangeably in popular discourse, but that's not necessarily true. Ethnicity is a grouping of people based on shared cultural heritage, language, and history. Ethnicity is more about kind of like nationhood, right? Although race and ethnicity are often used as synonyms in popular discourse, ethnicity is closer to nationality in academic settings. So, for example, so when we talk about immigration, we're going to talk about the Irish. Were the Irish white? Well, guess what? They weren't considered white when they first got here. But because they were ethnically European, over time they became white, which again, we're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But it will when we get to it. And we're going to get kind of a taste of that today when we talk about some things happening in early America. But just know ethnicity is not going to be a huge focus of today's class, but I think at the very least I want to define it now so that when it comes up later, we'll have at least a basic understanding of what I mean by ethnicity versus race. That was just a quick kind of overview of vocabulary. And again, if you're not on board with the whole structural racism thing, that's okay. But just know that this is a basic assumption that I'll be using when I talk about some of this history. And again, whether you're on board or not, I think this history is going to be interesting and important to talk about. So we're done with the vocab. Let's jump into Bacon's Rebellion. In kind of British colonialism, Jamestown was considered the first really kind of successful commercial colony in the New World. Just in terms of the overall history of kind of British colonialism, Jamestown is considered really important because it was the first one that kind of like survived and thrived, right? At least from a commercial standpoint. And very early on, now again, the 1619 Project is named so because in 1619, colonial Virginia was the first British colony to import enslaved Africans from the Caribbean to Jamestown to serve against their will in a state of bondage. And there were certain issues that came up in colonial Virginia that really kind of like made American slavery distinctly American in ways that was different from other forms of slavery before. So let's talk about that a little bit. Enslaved Africans, again, were brought to Jamestown in 1619. They were considered property. So I think that's, we all understand that and know that. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. The children of enslaved folks caused a legal conundrum. And here's why. Under English common law, of children follow the father. Okay, let me explain what that means. So in other words, let's say I'm a British guy and, I have an enslaved woman that I own, and one of my white field hands sexually assaults her, which sadly was a very common thing. She gets pregnant, right? Under English common law, that child would be free, would not be enslaved, right? And that sadly created a problem in the minds of English people who were, overseeing this system. Right. So what about the child of an enslaved woman and a free man? Were they British subjects? Were they free? This created a conundrum. Again, I'm not saying it's a conundrum for me. I'm saying for the British people who were slowly introducing more and more enslaved folks in their society. This created a problem. So in 1662, the government, this is the colonial government, again, this is before, 1776, obviously, the government introduced a legal doctrine known as partus sequitur ventrum, which is Latin for that which is born follows the womb, which tied slavery to maternal lineage. Now, again, you might be like, this is kind of wonky. Like, I don't really care. Like, what does that have to do with anything? But this is actually a really important moment. It's an important moment for two reasons. One, it shows kind of a uniquely American understanding of slavery being developed. Because again, slavery is super old. Slavery's been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. British colonists did not invent slavery. However, they did invent this. They really kind of retooled kind of the whole system of slavery to fit their particular context. So now, after 1662, if an enslaved woman had a child, didn't matter who the father was, that child was also enslaved, which really sadly and disturbingly, kind of built sexual assault and rape into the system of American slavery. Again, sexual assault and rape had been a part of human slavery for millennia. That was not new. But what was new was that it was kind of racialized, right? So again, I'll talk about more what that means. But this was kind of the beginning of, in the minds of colonists, tying race to slavery, right? For most of human history, slavery had been like colorblind, basically. It had been an economic and kind of like an economic status that was forced on people, right? And in some cases, there were societies where people sold themselves into slavery because they had no other options. However, in the United States, this was in North America, not United States yet, in colonial America, this was the first time that enslavement and kind of skin color had really started to be tied together. But we're not quite there yet, because we need to talk about one other group, which is indentured servants. I'm going to make myself disappear. So during the colonial era, many poor Brits, in particular like Irish people, came to America as indentured servants. They would contractually enter an agreed upon period of servitude in exchange for free passage across the Atlantic and housing food upon arrival. Some indentured servants were forced into it as well. Some were like, prisoners, particularly like Irish prisoners. But either way, this was a parallel system to slavery. So what we see here, this is an actual reproduction of an indenture. And it's hard to see, but basically it's like a contract. Like it basically says the person's name, who is entering the indenture, who they're indentured to, how long. It was kind of like a contract, right? Well, it wasn't kind of, it was a contract. Legally, indentured servants held a status only slightly better than enslaved folks during their indenture. This is really important to understand. So again, in kind of the mid 1600s, you have enslaved people of African descent. You have indentured servants, or poor English and Irish folks. And in terms of their legal status, they were treated pretty similarly. And here's just some examples of that. Their contract could be bought and sold without consent, right? So, again, if I own a person, whether it's temporarily through an indenture or, through a kind of purchase through enslavement, I can sell that, quote unquote, property to another person. Masters could beat them without impunity. Again, both indentured servants and enslaved folks could be beaten with no penalty. And both enslaved folks and indentured servants needed permission to marry. So again, the status of slaves and indentured servants were pretty similar. And initially, the number of indentured servants far outweighed enslaved folks. So in the early colonial era, kind of the 1600s in particular, slavery was not as an important an economic and political system as indentured servitude was. Now, just kind of like contemporary connection, today, some people will use this fact, will point out, well, hey, indentured servants were basically treated like slaves. So therefore, this must be true. So this is a meme I found online. White Irish slaves were treated worse than any other race in the US. When was the last time you heard an Irishman bitching how the world owes them a living, right? So in other words, this is kind of on the kind of, I think, like kind of hard right or extreme right. There are some people who will say, well, there were lots of white people who were indentured in colonial America. And therefore we don't need to still talk about how slavery affected, Black people. I mean, this is just historically erroneous. As we'll find out, indentured servitude was basically phased out completely. And, we're talking about a few thousand indentured servants versus like millions of enslaved folks. So it's just the scale of it was not the same. However, it is true that in the earliest days, enslaved folks and indentured servants were similar in terms of how they were treated. However, that changed after a really important event known as Bacon's Rebellion.
The elite, many of whom lived on the coast of the Atlantic, were somewhat removed from direct contact with indigenous groups. This wasn't the case with the common planter. One by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, cousin of William Barclay, took issue. Based on a letter written by Bacon's wife to her sister, dated June 26, 1676, Bacon had written several letters to Governor Barclay to appeal for him to assist the English planters in dealing with the indigenous groups who had attacked and killed some Englishmen in the area, including one who was Bacon's overseer. She calls the people troublesome Indians. In addition to lives being lost, she claims that they had taken cattle. She took it as far as saying Barclay was friends with the natives and wouldn't harm a single one. So without swift action from Barclay to move against the natives and pay them back for their actions, she claims the poor came to her husband and appealed to him to assist. Bacon and 500 men, English indentured servants, and enslaved Africans, and also freemen attacked the natives without commission for Barclay. They ravished many of the surrounding areas and native communities and killed many people. This turned into a bloody conflict. The group eventually marched to the House of Burgesses and burned it down. Her claim was there was no one against Bacon but the governor and a few of his great friends who had gotten estates from the governor. Barclay was extremely angry with Bacon for this and ordered him to be captured and hanged. Bacon eventually got sick and passed away in October of 1676. Troops were sent to quell the conflict, and based on an account by one British naval commander, Thomas Grantham, there were free men, indentured men, and enslaved men. So the research tells us that there was a problem with social control. If the system was to work for the economic goals of the colonies, a control mechanism had to be put in place to ensure incidents like Bacon's Rebellion would not occur. Indentured servants and enslaved Africans working together to challenge the system was not going to happen again. The planters weren't going to allow an alliance between the two groups. As a strategy, the English colonists employed a very simple tactic. They elevated the status of the English person with the least amount of wealth, power, and prestige and placed them above any African person. While Africans were viewed as hereditary slaves, indentured servants were given special rights through laws that targeted African Americans and Native Americans. At the rebellion, these are some of the actions taken by the Virginia General Assembly. In 1676, Act 1, natives captured during the rebellion would be in captivity for life. 1680, Act 7, punishment for raising a hand at a Christian could get you 30 lashes, or running away from the plantation without permission and resisting arrest could result in death. It wasn't lawful for any Negro to carry a club, a staff, a gun, sword, or any other weapon in defense or offense. In 1682, Act 3, enslaved people were not able to congregate on the plantation other than their own for more than 4 hours. In April of 1691, which is a very critical one, this is Act 16, limited manumission of the enslaved. Freed persons had to be taken out of the colony within 6 months. Interracial couples had to leave the colony. White women were punished for marrying non-white men, and this is really specific to African men. This is the first time in colonial records that the term white was associated with a group of people. Prior to this, the main terms were English and Christian. After Bacon's Rebellion, the focus centered on Africans as the main source of labor and with a lifetime tag as a slave. What was happening at the same time was the expansion and codification of whiteness to include other European groups, and the shaping of white to form the ideological premise that anyone classified as white was superior to those in any non-white category, not just in theory, but through legal and social practice.
Okay, that video gave you a lot of detail. Not all of it's important, so let me just highlight the things that I think are important. So 1676, Virginia colony farmers were angry the government wasn't defending them from Indian attacks, right? Planter Nathaniel Bacon, and planter means he owned like a large farm, led a coalition of farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans in a violent protest that torched Jamestown, which again, that's what you're seeing in this, as you're seeing in this picture here, Jamestown is burning, right? And they almost completely destroyed it. So this was not, this was not good news for the folks in charge. So This alliance of oppressed folks scared the political elites. They being the colonial legislature and the people in charge, passed a series of laws kind of in the years after, elevating the status of poor Englishmen and lowering the status of enslaved Africans. So again, this is an old kind of divide and conquer tactic, right? If people in the bottom of society are realizing that they have some similar grievances, well, let's separate them and make some of them have a slightly better status than the others. So how did that work? One of the ways it worked was indentured servitude was eventually phased out. So basically, by the time we get to the revolution, there were hardly any indentured servants around, at least comparatively to enslaved folks, while African slavery was ramped up, right? So it was kind of just both a political and an economic decision to, phase out this cheap labor system and go with this cheap labor system, right? And this is where the term white comes from, basically. So kind of before Bacon's Rebellion, descriptors like English and Christian were used to identify the colonists of European descent, right? So yeah, basically, like again, if you took a time machine back to 1676 and asked people, "Are you white?" they wouldn't understand what you're talking about. If you asked people, "Are you English? Are you Christian?" that was their identifier. However, by the time we get to kind of the 1710s, 1720s, the word white was like the most kind of common kind of racial descriptor for people of European descent. And it was a term of privilege and power to contrast with black, which is a term denoting servitude and inferiority. Also, at that time, like Negro was used a lot, which is again a term we don't use anymore. But at that time, Negro is considered like kind of a non-offensive descriptor. But again, Negro is just kind of from the Latin word for black, so it was kind of the same thing. Thus, both whiteness and white supremacy were born. So again, at the beginning when I said whiteness is the concept, here's what I mean, right? Basically, you have the creation of the concept of white. And it would stretch and strain over the ensuing centuries to include various Euro-ethnic groups. So again, as I said, when the Irish first got here in large numbers, they were not considered white. By the kind of 1920s, 30s, 40s, they were considered white, which I think is like some really good evidence for this idea that like whiteness is not like a biological fact. It's like a social construct that changes over time, and it's a social construct that is used to kind of delineate who is inferior and who is superior, right? And after Bacon's Rebellion, slavery just really like skyrocketed in the colonies. So this is just the Virginia colonies, right? So in 1650 we have like maybe a few hundred, and by 1700 we have over 10,000 enslaved people of African descent. So now, did Bacon's Rebellion cause this directly? No, I can't say that. This might have just happened naturally without Bacon's Rebellion, but Bacon's Rebellion, I think, is a really important historical marker for this shift in thinking, and again for this kind of larger project of tying enslavement and status as an enslaved person to race. They might be saying, okay, Virginia was one colony. There were 13 colonies, but the racial policies and ideologies of colonial Virginia would, as I said, would spread throughout the colonies. The invention of whiteness was a crucial antecedent to unifying the colonies under the new American identity. So again, hopefully you're tying this to other things we talked about. Think about Thomas Paine, right? Thomas Paine's Common Sense, where he kind of argued that Americanness was a badge of pride, not something to be ashamed of. When Thomas Paine was spreading this idea, he was not talking about enslaved Africans at all. Like nobody thought that, right? It was understood that when he was talking about Americans, he was white Americans, right? Americans of European descent. And at that time, again, that was a non-controversial kind of understanding that everybody had. So again, I think Bacon's Rebellion marks a really important kind of juncture in history when kind of whiteness is being invented and blackness is being tied to kind of enslavement, right? Even though there were free blacks, but in the minds of American colonists, that was a really important idea. Also, one other point about the Virginia colony was that if you look at the founding era, some of these I know you've heard of. We've all heard of Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. These guys are slightly less famous. This guy's kind of forgotten. He's a really important founder who kind of gets left off. There's kind of a top like 8 or 9 really influential founders. These 5 are always on that top list of influential founders. And these 5 all were from the Virginia colony, and eventually, became a state, obviously, after the Revolution, the Treaty of Paris. And all of them were slaveholders as well. it's true that Virginia was just one colony among 13. Some of the things that happened in Virginia were really influential and important. And Virginia's movements to fix race to slavery, it was not the only colony that was doing it, but I think it was the most influential and important. And again, these ideas are really important to the founders themselves and to the founding documents, as we looked at when we looked at the Constitution a few classes ago, right? I want to make one more point before going on to our case studies, which is I just want to talk about how America's system of slavery was kind of unique in terms of global history. So here's what I mean by that. So brutality, cruelty, and sexual violence have been basic features of slave systems for millennia. Slavery is one of the ugliest systems human beings have ever come up with, but it is very old. It goes back thousands of years, right? We have evidence of various ancient cultures enslaving people. So, what the British colonists did in North America is, in some ways, is not new at all, right? It's a very, very ugly thing that humans have engaged in for, since before history. However, in the American context, slavery uniquely became racialized. So again, what does racialized mean? Well, it's a process in which race shapes something. Meaning, so in this context, by racialized, I mean tied to emerging Enlightenment ideas about race, skin color, and inferiority, right? So in other words, and again, like slave system for thousands of years have dabbled in inferiority, right? These people are less than us, it's okay to enslave them. So again, American slavery was not new in that way. What was new was that this system got tied to a kind of racial caste or status, right? Because your skin color is such that it is, and your hair type, and the origin, the part of the world that your ancestors came from, because of all that, you are inherently inferior because of your race, and because you are inherently inferior, it is okay to enslave you, right? And this is why the American system was different relative to the long tragic litany of other human cultures who have enslaved folks for thousands and thousands of years. So for the second half of class, we're going to turn to this question: how did slavery continue to shape the U.S. after it ended? I think there are lots of ways. I'm going to just highlight two. Again, we're going to look at jazz, and we're going to look at the history of miscegenation laws. Now, before we do that, I want to ask you this question, right? Because again, today, a lot of people will say, sure, slavery, happened in the past, but why do we have to keep digging it up, right? This picture kind of literally shows that. And however, other people feel the opposite, right? Other people would tie things, for example, kind of police brutality, the Black Lives Matter movement, to kind of the residue and legacies of slavery. So again, the point is we disagree over this.
Okay, here I think is a good time to take a little pause. I'd like you to go to the Lino board. Again, type this in. This is case sensitive, so you have to type it in exactly as you see it with the capital letters. And I would like you to answer this question. To what extent does the legacy of slavery continue to shape race relations and issues in America? A lot, a little, or not at all? And then back up your viewpoint with some data, excuse me. Back up and explain your viewpoint with 1 to 2 examples, illustrations, or arguments. So I just kind of want you to form your own opinion and illustrate your opinion using some kind of data, fact, or whatever.
Okay, again, quick review. We started with the 1619 Project, and as kind of, this debate over to what extent slavery still shapes our lives today. We did some basic race vocab, and then we looked at a really important moment, Bacon's Rebellion, which again, just to kind of reiterate, I don't think Bacon's Rebellion created race, but it was a moment in history when we see the beginnings of what we now understand as race in America. So now we're going to turn to jazz. And again, I think this, regardless of your personal opinions on race, as part of why reason I'm picking this is because I think it can be really instructive to pick something that is like not really controversial, right? Jazz is not a controversial thing. However, I think when we see some of the things that shape jazz, you'll I think understand why I would say slavery continued to shape American life in ways that are really, really, really surprising. So I'm calling this section Jazz, Race, and Resistance. And here's kind of my point for this case study. The story of jazz demonstrates how deep racial structures shape American culture in surprising ways. Again, I've probably said that so much you're tired of hearing it. However, jazz also illustrates the long history of African Americans resisting oppression through joyful and unapologetic creative expression. So again, freedoms and fault lines, right? Obviously, it's a huge fault line. But at the same time, I think it just seems just for me personally, I teach a class called American Music and Culture. I absolutely love teaching that class because I think American music, it reflects our really ugly history, but at the same time, it also captures people taking some of the ugliness of our history and making something really beautiful and celebratory out of it. And I think jazz is a great case study, which again captures the freedoms and the fault lines of this issue. So let's dig in, and we're going to start with New Orleans, Louisiana, aka NOLA. I'm going to be calling it NOLA throughout this lecture because it's just shorter, fewer syllables. And again, New Orleans is a city on the Gulf Coast in New Orleans, and New Orleans is also the birthplace of jazz, right? There are certain key American music genres that come from very, very, very particular places under very particular circumstances, and jazz is a great example of this. By the way, little commercial. I went to New Orleans maybe like 10 years ago, and absolutely loved it. It's just a beautiful, fascinating, complex city. I don't think there's anywhere else in America like it, and I think by the end of this lecture, you understand why. I'm going to explain some of the reasons why. You should put New Orleans on your bucket list. If you go there, don't just get drunk and party on Bourbon Street, which you see here. Really dig into the culture and the history. Go to museums, go on a tour. It's just a fascinating, fabulous, beautiful city. And I think for the reasons I'm about to explain. Before we do that, however, let's just start with some jazz. I'm sure we all know what jazz sounds like, but you might not know what kind of like historic jazz sounds like. So I'm going to play a song, just about a minute and a half snippet of a song called Dipper Mouth Blues by King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, one of the really early influential jazz bands in the 1920s. And again, this is instrumental music. There's no singing, which some of you might not be a fan of, but whether you like this music or not, give it a try. Close your eyes, maybe even listen to some of the different instruments, listen to what's going on. And as you're listening to it, kind of ask yourself, okay, what does this have to do with the history of race? Because it's not apparent or obvious at all, but by the end, I think it will be. All right, check this out. Okay, I view New Orleans as a kind of unprecedented experiment, excuse me, in multiculturalism. Like there's just nowhere else, not just in the United States, but in the world like New Orleans. And here's why. It has just a very, very, very complicated history. Here is kind of a short list of the various groups who contributed to what is now New Orleans. So obviously before colonization, Native Americans lived there, right? In 1701, the French were the first to colonize New Orleans, which to this day is why there's some people in New Orleans who still speak French. A few years later, African slavery is introduced. So we have people, again, people of African descent, mostly from the Caribbean. In 1763, there's all these different colonial powers, and they're all fighting with each other. So eventually, Spain takes it over. And this is where the kind of Creole culture emerges. So Creole just basically means kind of like a mixture of Spanish and French, as well as some African influences as well. A few years later, Cajuns show up. So Cajuns are actually they're basically like refugees, like persecuted refugees from French Canada. And because there's this history of French culture in New Orleans, it made sense for them to come there. So Cajuns are to this day a really distinct kind of ethnic group in New Orleans. And then Haitian refugees start coming. So again, you have kind of like very, very distant African influences from a particular part of the Caribbean that had a very, very unique kind of Haitian culture. So they start coming as well. And then Spain gives it back to France. France takes it over again. And then, as we learned a few years later, Napoleon is trying to get rid of his overseas colonies and sells Louisiana Purchase, which includes New Orleans, to the United States. And then Americans start coming. Americans, both free white Americans and enslaved Black Americans, start coming. And then there's also waves of European immigration that affected the United States in general. Because again, by this point, by the early 1800s, New Orleans is part of the United States, and Germans, Italian, Irish, Chinese, these various immigrant communities start coming. This is what I mean by New Orleans kind of multicultural gumbo. Like there's just nowhere else in kind of North America or the area that would become the United States that has this kind of rich and complex of a history, and that completely shaped things like music, right? As we'll find out soon. But it also shaped basically New Orleans has a unique culture that's not like anywhere else. So I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. This really starts with the Spanish conquistadors. The Spanish colonization looked different than British colonization. Obviously, as you can see from this picture, it was, I think, their relationship to the native populations was similar in terms of it was generally exploitive, brutal relationship. However, there was one really, really important feature, which was this. The Spanish colonists tended to intermarry with the various groups that they were conquering and or bringing in to help them build their empires, right? So again, you have native populations, you have enslaved folks of African descent. In Spanish colonies, intermarriage was encouraged. There are a lot of reasons why. The main reason why was because Spanish colonialism was more shaped by Catholicism, whereas British colonialism was more shaped by Protestantism. So again, if you don't know what Protestantism is, we'll talk about that later when we talk about religion. But for our purposes today, just for whatever reason, Catholic theology was more prone to recognizing the humanity of these various groups that they were conquering. I mean, obviously, it's contradictory, right? It's like if you're conquering someone, are you actually recognizing their humanity? Well, no, by today's standards. But for that time, there was not this sense that like we are racially superior to these other groups. Whereas where we saw in the British colonies, there was this sense, right? So, a person of British descent marrying a person of African descent was generally not okay in the British colonies. In the Spanish colonies, it was fine. It was actually even like celebrated and encouraged in a lot of ways. And you're like, what does that have to do with jazz? We'll get there. Trust me. So race relations in New Orleans were just more complex and interesting than they were in any of the other colonies in North America. So again, this is one of the reasons, right? French and Spanish colonizers accepted open relationships between people of European and African descent. And this led to a really important kind of tradition, which is known as mestizaje. I don't speak Spanish, even though I look like I should. So if I said that wrong, I'm really sorry. But Spanish colonization was shaped by mestizaje, which is the mixing of races that create hybrid cultures. So there's even like artistic representations of this. So this is I think this is from Mexico. I can't remember exactly, but this is a kind of colonial era piece of art showing these various combinations of the various cultures in these Spanish empires. Latinx folks today often celebrate this as an alternative to the strict racial borders that shaped U.S. colonization. So it's also why today, if you're from Brazil or El Salvador or whatever, you probably, or your family is, you probably have a different understanding of race than Americans do, right? Well, this is a legacy of colonialism, which again, the larger point is that these large structures of slavery and colonialism, yeah, they happened a long time ago, but they still shape us today in really complex ways, right? So that really contrasted significantly with race relations in the U.S., where again, enslavement was overwhelmingly racialized, and that racialization of enslavement led to far more strict separation and kind of policing of boundaries between Black and white. This is another really important point. White masters and American slave colonies and eventually states viewed Black culture as inherently inferior, dangerous, and unchristian. They worked to stamp out and suppress the religious and musical traditions of enslaved Africans. Now, they did not do as good a job as they hoped they would have, which is, neither here nor there. It's kind of outside the topic of this class. But the point is, a lot of kind of traditional, music, forms of music and dance and religion and whatnot that the enslaved folks had kind of brought with them from Africa. There was more of an effort to try to like stamp out and suppress them in just kind of America in general. And that really contrasted with New Orleans, in which there was this really kind of longstanding tradition of kind of allowing enslaved folks that had Sundays, they had Sundays off. and their masters allowed them to gather, sing, and dance in a section named Congo Square. So to this day, you can visit New Orleans and see Congo Square. It's like a statue with a plaque explaining, the significance of it. But again, this was really unique because, again, Black music expressions were suppressed in virtually all other U.S. slave states. So there was just this really unique kind of expressive and aesthetic culture in New Orleans that was different from the rest of the United States. Again, I'm talking about before. This is all talking about like before the United States took over New Orleans with the Louisiana Purchase. Also, and why did I talk about all the intermarriage patterns and stuff? Like, who cares? Well, this is why. Because the direct result of that was the free people of color. So New Orleans had the largest population of free blacks who were known as free people of color in the South. Again, this is all before the United States took it over. And I think this is a really important point, so much so that I want you to get some notes on this. Again, French and Spanish colonists accepted interracial mixing. The British did not. That's just kind of a summary of some things I said in some previous slides for your notes. Creoles of color were kind of like this third race between white and black. Now, again, you're like, how can you be a race between white and black? Well, again, race is a social construct, right? I think that this again drives that point home. And Creoles of color, just in terms of the kind of the hierarchy of New Orleans, were seen as not quite as powerful and important as white, but definitely not as inferior as black. They were like a kind of an in-between group. No other North American region supported this social tradition. So this is a really important tradition in New Orleans, which again pre-existed Americans taking it over. Creoles of color enjoyed more privileges than blacks, including access to musical education. So here's a picture of some of the Creoles of color. I assume they're a family. And again, even just look at the way they're dressed, look at the way they're carrying themselves. There was a kind of social status and distinction with being a Creole of color that was, at least in the minds of people at that time, really, really separate and superior to black people, right? So again, it's weird to us, Americans, we think in black and white, but in New Orleans, they didn't think in black and white. They thought in black, white, and Creoles of color, right? There's these kind of three groups. And again, there's still unfortunately a racial hierarchy: white people at the top, black people at the bottom. But the Creoles of color, I think, was this really interesting, unique tradition that was not known outside of New Orleans for the most part. And again, when I played you that jazz song at the beginning, there's a reason why this group called themselves King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, right? It was this point of pride that they were kind of part of this like tradition that had been around for decades, right? Now, a lot of this changes in 1803, not immediately changes in 1803, but starts to change in 1803 when, again, the United States purchases, this huge chunk of territory from France, which includes New Orleans, right? So now, all of a sudden, New Orleans is an American city, right? So what happens after that? Well, let's check it out. So again, just to kind of set the distinction up, before the Louisiana Purchase, New Orleans had a really, really unique cultural tradition. So this is a picture of Mardi Gras, which I'm sure, if you don't know, you can Google it, which is a tradition I think most people know. And it's tradition of like intermarriage, Creoles of color, etc. And this kind of very unique culture gets all of a sudden faced by this culture, right? A culture that is increasingly, especially in the South, relying on enslaved labor for economic power and growth. And also this uniquely kind of racialized system of slavery, which viewed, in particular, viewed the Creoles of color as this like kind of absurd aberration that was just completely outside of everything that Americans thought, right? So you got to have this culture clash, and eventually, kind of the Americans won, basically, and we'll talk about that next. But first of all, let's just mention the Civil War. So Civil War happens. Louisiana is part of the seceding South. North wins, Louisiana's brought back in. And again, we talked about this whole Reconstruction era. Let me just briefly remind you that after the Civil War, there was a period of about roughly 14, 15 years where basically Northern soldiers occupied certain parts of the South to make sure that Black people, are given their rights. That comes to a pretty crashing halt in 1877, when the federal government is tired of dealing with racial issues and moves on to other things. And that affected New Orleans in really, really powerful and profound ways. One of the ways it affected New Orleans, actually, this is not an effect. This is a concurrent thing. There were lots of musical traditions that were kind of developing in America in the late 1800s, early 1900s that were influencing music in New Orleans, right? So these very kind of these very particularly New Orleans New Orleanian musical traditions are melding with some of these other kind of just general American music traditions, both folk music and classical music. And music in New Orleans is starting to become really, really, really distinct and unlike anywhere else in the country. So I'm going to play a little video about that just to kind of introducing you to some of the musical traditions that are mixing in New Orleans at the time.
Beginning in 1817, slaves in New Orleans were permitted to sing and dance every Sunday afternoon in a place called Congo Square. To the curious whites, who sometimes turned out to see and hear them, the slaves' music, filled with complex percussive rhythms, seemed to provide an authentic glimpse of Africa. But most of the slaves in Congo Square had never seen Africa. Many were recent arrivals from the West Indies, their music filled with the infectious pulse of the Caribbean. Other slaves had been brought to the city from the interior of the American South, bringing with them work songs, spirituals, and the call and response of the Baptist Church. That's the sign of the judgment. That's the sign of the judgment. This sign of the judgment. New Orleans was also home to a unique and prosperous community of free people who called themselves Creoles of color. Many were the light-skinned descendants of French and Spanish colonists and their black wives and mistresses. They identified with their European, not their African ancestors, and they looked down on the darker-skinned blacks around them. Some owned slaves. Many Creole musicians were classically trained and prided themselves on being able to play music for every kind of dancing. There is a mania in this city, the New Orleans Picayune reported in 1838, for horn and trumpet playing. Citizens of every color and nationality marched to the music of brass bands. City streets were filled with parades of every kind, weddings, funerals, feast days, and the 6 to 8 week carnival season that each spring led up to Mardi Gras. In the decades before the Civil War, New Orleans had 3 flourishing opera companies and 2 full-fledged symphony orchestras, one white and one Creole. There was so much music, so much dancing going on, that a northern visitor called New Orleans one vast waltzing and gallipating hall.
So as the video said, New Orleans already had this really unique and interesting musical culture that was this mixture of all these different influences. And the United States also has a really unique musical culture that was kind of seeping into New Orleans, and all these things were getting mixed and recombined in really, really, really fascinating ways. However, there's another really important and I think less happy and celebratory aspect of American culture that was also influencing New Orleans, and that was America's kind of white supremacy, right? So again, well, let me just tell you who we're looking at. This is Homer Plessy. He was an American Creole of color who basically did something that in his mind was completely fitting with his cultural traditions and understanding, but in the minds of white Americans was completely inappropriate. Now you look at him, you might think, oh, he's just a white guy. Well, no, he was a Creole of color. And again, he was a descendant of this kind of long tradition of this, relatively privileged, often educated group of folks living in New Orleans who view themselves as kind of racially, in terms of status and power, in between black and white. I'm going to pause here and just let this video do the talking, explain it a little bit. After the video, I'll come back and just highlight some things that I think are important for your notes.
Hi, I'm Uhuru Williams. I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about Plessy versus Ferguson. The Plessy versus Ferguson case originated with Louisiana's infamous Separate Car Act of 1890. The Separate Car Act required African Americans and whites to sit in segregated compartments on public carriers in Louisiana. People at the time of the Plessy decision actually believed that it was possible to measure the amount of black blood a person had in their body. The plaintiff in the Plessy case, Homer Adolph Plessy, was actually described as 7/8 white. Homer Plessy was arrested after he refused to give up his seat in defiance of the Separate Car Act of 1890. Plessy versus Ferguson is considered an important case because it established the doctrine of separate but equal that allowed states for the first time to legally segregate the races. One of the reasons that Homer Plessy brought suit was because of the difficulty in enforcing segregation in states like Louisiana. Louisiana had a large mixed race population, making it very difficult to determine where the line could be drawn in terms of separating the races. The doctrine of separate but equal that grew out of Plessy versus Ferguson became the standard for all segregation ordinances after that decision. Despite the Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the first municipality or city to pass a residential segregation ordinance was Baltimore, Maryland in 1910. The Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 ultimately was the death knell for the doctrine of separate but equal established in Plessy versus Ferguson.
Okay, so Homer Plessy was 1/8 black, meaning like somewhere in his lineage there was a black person. It was not recently, it was probably like a great grandmother or something, or great grandfather or something. But in the minds of Americans, he was black, right? Because you're either black or you're white. He was charged with breaking a New Orleans law mandating racial segregation on public trains. Again, he thought he was just doing what he was supposed to because, in his mind, he was not black, but in the minds of the people who were kind of running things in New Orleans at the time, he was. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, ruled against Plessy, right? So basically, there was a court case that wound through the court system of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against Plessy in favor of segregation, and basically declaring mandated segregation legal nationwide. Now, again, there were not mandated racial segregation laws in the North, generally speaking. There were in the South. However, wherever they were now legal. It was now legal to write openly racist laws. This case enshrined the one-drop rule, the social and legal concept that any black lineage in one's ancestry made one black. Again, this is, I think, further evidence that race is socially constructed, right? Does it make sense that like a person who has, one ancestor out of the last 8 ancestors they had was a black person? Is that person black? Well, I don't know. In the minds of the white people running society at the time, they said absolutely yes. And this led to all kinds of crazy, weird calculations where people who were like 1/16 black were permitted. Maybe they looked white, but it didn't matter. Legally speaking, they were black. And these laws created all kinds of bizarre situations all over the country. However, in the minds of the white segregationists who were kind of running society at the time, this was completely reasonable and much needed. And again, this is a direct legacy of slavery, right? Because under slavery, we have to separate people and keep white from black. Even though slavery had ended, that same mentality continued for generations and generations and generations, right? So this leads directly to jazz. Look, again, I thought this was supposed to be about jazz. Like, this is about jazz. This is where jazz comes from, basically. After Plessy versus Ferguson, New Orleans had become fully Americanized. In other words, now I'm not saying that its distinct and unique culture had been obliterated. It hadn't been. It still is very around, very distinct, very unique. However, at that time, this really marks kind of like the full like deconstruction of this whole Creoles of color thing, right? Which again had been around for decades and decades and decades. The Creoles of color were now black, right? They, at least in the eyes of the law, in the minds of the people running society, Creoles of color were now black, and this is where jazz comes from, right? These Creole musicians from a classical tradition begin to mingle with poor Black people from a more folk tradition, blues and gospel. And this is really, really where jazz comes from. And again, it is a direct result of these American racial ideas that Americans brought with them when they kind of took over New Orleans. And those American racial ideas, again, are a direct result of
Creole people suddenly became black people overnight. And these Creole orchestras, which existed at one point, suddenly disappeared. And these clarinetists had no work. So they were essentially forced to go into the black community. And that level of technical fluency forever changed the nature of the music.
Creole musicians merged their classical virtuosity with the blues-inflected music of black bands. Together, they would transform every kind of music played in New Orleans.
The blues had a strict kind of beat, and they were often slow, and they said exactly what they meant, and they meant exactly what they said. And the musicians sometimes had to fill in space from one phrase to the next one. And so it was that they began to fill in that space, and little by little they began to embellish it. And little by little it began to take on a distinctive life of its own. It was that moment where in a group effort, an individual might just shine on his own. You know, he had that space, he had that time, so fill it. And the individual began to fill the space with inventions that still stayed within the spirit of the piece. Other musicians in the same band, hearing one trumpet do it, well, the trombone will do it. And so the spirit of
Okay, now I just want to spend some time riffing on really the cultural importance of jazz. You know, jazz is a form of music pretty much everybody has heard of or knows about, but not a ton of people listen to jazz today. Like it feels kind of like this old-timey bygone music that we don't really think about anymore. However, you know, this form of music, which again comes from this very particular city under this very set of racial circumstances, really is the first form of I think, really, really, really globally important American music. So let me kind of make the case for that. So number one, the first part of this case is that we have an entire decade, the 1920s, which is known as the Jazz Age or the Jazz Era, right? As far as I know, there's no other decade that has a name named after, or like an American kind of cultural era named after a particular form of music, right? And the importance of jazz was seen basically by the like so much so that people named an entire era off of it, right? Also, jazz was America's first crossover music. If you take my American music and culture class, I talk about this more. But unfortunately, American music has been very, very racially segregated pretty much up until the 1990s. For most American history, there were like black stations and white stations, and you didn't hear black artists on white stations and vice versa. Jazz really was the beginning, the first time when that really starts to break down. Jazz is the first form of music largely created by Black people that was embraced by white people, both white artists and white fans as well. So it's really important in that way. In that I think, again, I think it's a good example of celebratory outcome that came out of this really ugly history, right? And kind of as further evidence of that, jazz was kind of America's first integrated music genre. So, for example, this group, who kind of gets forgotten by history, but they're called the International Sweethearts of Rhythm. They were America's first racially integrated and all-women jazz band. And if you look very carefully, you'll see, black and white women here. But jazz, again, was the first music to really kind of bring Americans of different races together across racial lines, both in terms of who was performing this music, who was going to, jazz clubs and patronizing this music, who was listening to it, who was buying it. It was kind of the first kind of like multiracial genre. And also for about 3 decades, jazz was and is American popular music. So pretty much from 1920 to about 1952, kind of when rock and roll starts to come around. American music, American popular music was jazz. Jazz was American popular music. You've got Frank Sinatra here, right? We have kind of the big band era, swing music, right? The jazz age, flappers, right? Jazz really for several decades was a core component of American music and American identity. And again, I'm not saying that this makes all this ugly racial history okay. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that I think jazz is a good example that even in the most ugly parts of our history, there are beautiful things that can come out of that, right? And let me just talk about jazz a little bit more because I think it would be criminal of me not to play this clip. I'm going to play a clip from a movie called Hell's a Poppin', great title, from 1941. Not a very good movie, but it was a movie that includes, it was kind of like a musical movie about jazz and jazz culture. And it has this fantastic scene of black swing dancers. So swing dancing is a form of jazz dancing that's kind of, every once in a while, comes back in popularity. It was really popular in like the late 90s for some reason. But again, I think this showcases just kind of like the joy and the energy and just the power of jazz music for jazz fans, particularly in the 1940s. So let me just shut up and stop talking. Check this video out. If this video doesn't make you smile, I question your humanity.
Hey, Pops, keep that beat a beating. I feel a rhythmic brainstorm coming on. 1, 2, keep that rhythm heating. One more riff like that and I'll be gone. Oh man, don't stop now, we're jumping. Give everything to Lord now. This thing might turn into something. I ain't mistaken, here comes something now.
All right, one more point about jazz before we move on. In 1964, there was the first annual Berlin Jazz Festival, which again speaks to the international and global reach of jazz, right? That again, this form of music that came out of this very, very, very particular racial historical circumstance in a very particular place, New Orleans, was jazz in a lot of ways was the first kind of major American musical export, right? Jazz was popular all over the world, on pretty much every continent, honestly. And in 1964, there was this International Jazz Festival in Berlin, and Martin Luther King was asked to kind of write like a little essay or a foreword kind of in celebration of that festival. And I think his words really kind of encapsulate what I'm trying to say with jazz, that like jazz came out of this ugly racial history, and yes, it doesn't justify it, but I think at the very least, it demonstrates that even the ugliest parts of our history can create really beautiful things can come out of that. And I think that's something to be celebrated, just as an American, whether regardless of your race. All right, here's a little video of just different kind of current jazz musicians, kind of reading or quoting the words of Martin Luther King. So I hope you enjoy this video. We'll switch topics after we come back.
God has wrought many things out of oppression.
He has endowed his creatures with the capacity to create.
And from this capacity has flowed the sweet songs of sorrow and joy that have allowed man to cope with his environment in many different situations.
Jazz speaks for life.
The blues tell the story of life's difficulties.
And if you think for a moment, you will realize that they take the hardest realities of life and put them into music,
only to come out with some new hope or sense of triumph.
This is triumphant music. This is triumphant music.
This is triumphant music.
Modern jazz has continued in this tradition,
singing the songs of a more complicated urban existence.
When life itself offers no order and meaning,
the musician creates an order and meaning from the sounds of the earth which flow through his instrument.
It is no wonder that so much of the search for identity among American Negroes was championed by jazz musicians.
Long before the modern essayists and scholars wrote of racial identity as a problem for a multiracial world,
musicians were returning to their roots to affirm that which was stirring within their souls.
Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music.
It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail.
It has calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down.
And now, jazz is exported to the world.
For in the particular struggle of the Negro in America, there is something akin to the universal struggle of modern man.
Everybody has the blues.
Everybody longs for meaning.
Everybody needs to love and be loved.
Everybody needs to clap hands and be happy.
Everybody longs for faith.
In music, especially this broad category called jazz, there is a stepping stone towards all of these.
And now for our last section, we're going to be looking at miscegenation laws. And again, I'm kind of like combining these two. We're going to look at miscegenation laws and also how American movies were kind of reflecting some of the issues and concerns in the evolution of this issue of Americans' attitudes towards interracial sexuality or romance, love, that kind of stuff, right? Now, before I do that, I want to acknowledge that many of you are probably thinking, like, who cares? Like, there are lots of interracial couples today. It's just not that big of a deal. It's not really a controversy. Like, why do we need to talk about this? And actually, that's demonstrated in the data. This is a Gallup poll from a few years ago. 94% of Americans approve of interracial marriage. You might even say a little bit shocked and disturbing that 6% of Americans still are opposed to it. But we're going to find out why. Because opposing interracial marriages have been the norm in American society. That's been reflected again in law, in movies, and in so many things. So if I could kind of pause here and make a little personal connection. So this is my family. This is my wife and daughter. My daughter is about to turn 11. Been married for about 14 years. So obviously I'm in an interracial marriage, which again, you're like, who cares? Well, the reason I say who cares is because we got married 14 years ago. And at that time, so I grew up in a really conservative religious home, and there were people in my family, I won't say who, who were very, 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 very opposed to us being together. And used colorful, wonderful words like abomination to describe the fact that we, wanted to be together. So when I tell this history, this is not just some abstract stuff that just happened to random people. This history has directly shaped my life, and this is one of the reasons why I enjoy talking about it. So let's just kind of again maybe thought it was inappropriate, but I've in the past I've gotten positive feedback from students when I make things personal. They feel like it makes the content more relevant. So with that being said. Let's talk about miscegenation laws. And here's kind of, the point of this section. The story of miscegenation laws illustrates how the racial ideologies of slavery shaped even the most intimate of human relations, right? People falling in love and wanting to be together. Something that personal and private, yes, even something that personal and private was shaped by the history of slavery. This story, I think specifically the story of like interracial romance and love being something that was really controversial to becoming something nobody cares about. This story also shows that American society is capable of addressing and correcting past racial injustices, right? So it is actually possible, and I think this particular issue illustrates that. Now, again, you might maybe if you're a little more cynical, you might disagree with me, and that's fine. But this is kind of what I think this history is going to illustrate. So let's jump in. Okay, so just quick refresher, and in terms of your notes, if you already have this, you might not have to write this down. Slavery has existed for much of human history. However, the American slave system was the first to explicitly tie enslavement to skin color, right? And again, we already talked about this. This is when I say racialization of slavery, this is what I mean. For early Anglo-Americans, Blackness was highly correlated with inferiority servitude, which we already saw, and sexual repulsiveness, which we didn't talk about. Now, again, repulsive is a strong word. You might be like, that's a really strong word, DeVos. Yeah, but I think it's descriptive and accurate. Um, there was a view that interracial sexuality was not just frowned upon, but it was like disgusting, right? So why would you want to marry someone you viewed as inferior and repulsive, right? Exactly. So again, slavery shaped this idea that interracial sexuality was disreputable, disgusting, and even like a form of pollution. And just as a kind of like case study to illustrate this, okay, so you're probably like, what am I looking at? Let me break this down. All right, Thomas Jefferson, right, third president of the United States. When he was president, his wife had been dead for a while, and Thomas Jefferson had slaves, had hundreds of slaves, both before, after, and during his presidency. And during his presidency in particular, when his wife had been dead for a while, this rumor started circulating that basically he had been carrying on. It's hard to say what to call it because it's with an enslaved woman. Is it a relationship? Is it an affair? Is it abusive? I don't know. But he had been kind of like involved with one of his enslaved women, a woman named Sally Hemings, right? So in 1802, in particular, a journalist published a salacious story alleging that Thomas Jefferson had been carrying on a years-long affair. Again, can we call it an affair if it's with an enslaved woman? We can debate that, but that was the language at the time, and had fathered several children with Sally Hemings, his slave. He was single at the time, so why the scandal? Now, the scandal was not because um, it was abusive and disgusting to have children with an enslaved woman and not actually treat her as an equal. However, that's not why people were scandalized. This is why they were scandalized. White slave owners could and did father children with enslaved women. That was not controversial. I mean, it obviously was somewhat controversial, but like it was understood that was part of the system, right? And that was not why people were upset. This is why people were upset. The idea that the president would have a romantic partnership was beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior. This is a really good illustration of some of the complex and like gross ways that slavery shaped views of sexuality. Right? Was that it was frowned upon. It was like an open secret. Like everybody knew that slave masters and slave overseers and other just white men in power could and did sexually assault enslaved women. And while some people thought it was wrong, nobody did anything about it. It was an open secret. It was just part of the system. This was not controversial for that reason. This was controversial because the idea that this very powerful white man would like willingly have a relationship with a black woman was just considered beyond the pale. Now, this is a really interesting topic. This particular topic is really interesting. Long story short, in the 90s, there were some DNA tests that proved pretty much beyond a shadow of a doubt that Thomas Jefferson did have at least one, possibly four children with Sally Hemings. There are some hardcore old white men who love Thomas Jefferson who still think that's impossible and he would never do something so ridiculous and disgusting. But for a lot of historians, this is settled history that this definitely happened. But I'm sorry, it kind of took us on a detour. Let's jump back into our story. For American slavery to operate, the people in charge worked to tirelessly separate white from black. There's a typo there. Thus, colonies and eventually states almost all passed laws barring interracial marriage. So again, miscegenation laws, and we're going to find out soon why they were called that. You're like, that's not a word. Well, yeah, it was a word that was invented. But these laws barring interracial marriage directly come out of slavery, right? Because in order for the system to work, we have to have one group has to be superior, the other has to be inferior, and we don't want the superior group mixing with the inferior group because that's going to mess up these boundaries. I want to look at a particular law. So in 1691, the Virginia Colony Legislature, again, remember it's not a state yet, so it's a colonial legislature, passed this statute. A statute is a law. People talked very differently back then than we do now. So this law is going to be in it like almost like in another language. So I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to break it down and explain to you what it's talking about. All right, this is one big sentence. For the prevention of that abominable mixture and spurious issue, which hereafter may increase in this dominion, as well by Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians intermarrying with English or other white women, as by their unlawful accompanying with one another. Actually, let me pause there. Okay, there's some. I could write an entire PhD dissertation just on that phrase. Okay, first of all, I want to point out intermarrying with English, right? So again, this was a few decades after Bacon's Rebellion. So here we see just captured here that English, which at that time meant white, was kind of being replaced with and paired with white. So again, this really captures this term, this vocab term kind of emerging. Also notice it says intermarrying with English or other white women. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is that these miscegenation laws, while they were applied to men and women, white men and women, preserving white womanhood was much more like at the forefront of the minds of the people who's writing these laws. Okay, so that's point one. Point two, I want to talk about abominable mixture and spurious issue. So abominable mixture means interracial mixing. Again, abomination, like that's a really harsh word. It's an old-timey word we don't use anymore, but it just means like really, 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 really disgusting. Mixture, people of different racial groups mixing. And spurious issue. So spurious just means like kind of like questionable or like inappropriate. Issue means children. Really? Yeah. So in kind of older versions of English, when a woman gave birth, she issued forth a person, right? So basically it's saying they don't want mixed kids, right? Right? Why? Well, because it's an abomination. It's disgusting. Which hereafter may increase in this dominion. They don't want mixed kids in their dominion, in their colony. As well by Negroes, mulattoes. Mulattoes means mixed race, but in their minds, black people, and Indians intermarrying with English or the white women, as by their unlawful accompanying of one another. Again, unlawful accompanying, being together sexually in either in or outside of marriage. So be it enacted by the authority aforesaid, and it is hereby enacted. It's just fancy legal language, that for the time to come, whatsoever English or other white man or woman. Now, again, it's saying man or woman, but really, they already showed their cards. They're mostly concerned with women, white women. English or other white man or woman being free shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free. So again, whether it's an enslaved person or not, doesn't matter, because again, we're trying to police racial lines here. Within 3 months after such marriage, be banished and removed from this dominion forever. So basically, you're kicked out of the colony if you were caught breaking this law. All right, let's go back to the last point. As other groups, so for example, Chinese, Japanese, etc., arrive in the ensuing centuries, these laws are often amended to include and or exclude them. So again, these laws start in the colonial era, and they continue after the revolution, after the Treaty of Paris and statehood. They can pretty much most of the states pass these. Eventually, they kind of go away in some of the northern states. But these laws were flexible. So as immigration patterns changed, the laws changed too. So for example, in the kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, kind of like mid 1800s, large numbers of Chinese, particularly men, start coming from mainland China to California. And very quickly, there was a panic over that, and laws were passed making it illegal, right? And again, this language is gross and ugly and racist. And you like, that appeared in a newspaper headline? Yes, it did. Why? Well, because interracial marriage was from the colonial era, centuries later, people still thought it was disgusting, right? And now, so when Indians, so people from India, not Native Americans, when Indians started coming here, they were generally called Hindus, even though maybe not all of them were Hindu. But again, it didn't matter. That was the term. And laws could also be adjusted to prevent these kinds of relationships as well, right? So this was again a longstanding tradition in America, and I think these images reflect that. Okay, so let's talk about miscegenation. Where did that come from? Miscegenation was an invented word, which means interracial sexual mixing. It was invented in the 1850s by combining the Latin words miscere to mix with genus, race. So again, this is a uniquely American word, miscegenation is. And the word was first invented Abraham Lincoln's reelection. So again, Abraham Lincoln was elected president for his first term. The South seceded in response, and he ran for president again during the Civil War. And there were forces in the North, South wasn't voting in the election at this time. There were forces in the North that did not want Abraham Lincoln to get reelected. So then and now, when you don't want someone to get reelected, you smear them, right? And you spread rumors that aren't true about them. So one of the rumors that was spread was that if Abraham Lincoln was reelected, which of course he was, that Black men were going to start marrying white women, right? And this was a pamphlet called "What Miscegenation Is." That was a very popular pamphlet that circulated all around the North. Again, trying to rally people around preventing Abraham Lincoln get reelected. And again, well, who cares? Well, in the minds of people, that this was disgusting, right? This was like the last thing they wanted to happen, was open interracial marriages happening all over the place, particularly Black men with white women. And again, this for some people was an effective piece of political propaganda that led them not to vote for Abraham Lincoln. Here's another political cartoon. I guess this is a pamphlet on the left. This is a political cartoon. Political cartoons are really, I think, powerful ways of kind of capturing different ideas throughout history. So this political cartoon is called the Miscegenation Ball. What do we have here? Well, here we have white men with Black women, which was not as controversial, but still was considered something that people didn't want. This political cartoon is basically arguing that if Abraham Lincoln is elected, there's going to be so much open interracial marriage that there's almost going to be like these interracial dancing and romance parties or whatever. It's absurd, it's ridiculous. But again, it captures this view that for millions of Americans, interracial marriage was just this disgusting, disreputable thing that they absolutely did not want. So by the Manifest Destiny era, most states had laws prohibiting such legal unions. So again, we kind of already have seen this, but I think it's important to point out again that this started in the colonial era when ideas about race and slavery were being developed, but it continued for centuries after. Most states had laws prohibiting such legal unions. I already said that. No laws existed prohibiting rape or sexual assault of enslaved women by white slave owners, which is I don't know what to say. It's disgusting. It's upsetting, but it's part of our history. And again, these laws extended into the 20th century. This is a law passed by the Virginia legislature, the state legislature, obviously, in 1924, called the kind of Racial Integrity Act. And here is some language from the law explaining to you why it exists. As color is the most important feature of this form of registration. So this is a law saying if you registered with social services or for a marriage license, you had to say what your race was. The local registrar must be sure that there is no trace of colored blood in anyone offering to register as a white person. So again, if you looked white, but your great, 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 great grandfather was Black, in the eyes of this law, you were Black. The penalty for willfully making a false claim as to color is 1 year in the penitentiary. And again, this I think is the implication is we don't want to pollute white blood, right? We don't want white people marrying with anyone who has any non-whiteness in them. Now, of course, how do you enforce this? How do you know? Well, again, those are logical questions to illogical laws, but this really captures kind of the fierceness and pervasiveness of these laws in certain parts of the country. These laws were not designed to stop miscegenation in the abstract. They were meant to protect white supremacy, especially the purity of white womanhood. Again, as we saw with the colonial law, it said in one part, we don't want men and women intermarrying, but in another part, it specifically says the concern really is white women, right? Because again, we talk about gender, some of these ideas will come up, but there's this longstanding view that, if whiteness is superior, if whiteness is inherently more more beautiful, more attractive, if that is a standard of beauty, then of course, in a patriarchal society, white womanhood is going to be the standard for beauty, right? However, restrictions on white men intermarrying were often more flexible. So, for example, okay, so here we have a picture from, I don't have dates on these, it's kind of like mid-1800s. Here is a Native American man and a white woman, and a white man and a Native American woman. Now there were laws regulating these relationships. However, the laws often were gendered. So in other words, if you had laws regulating this particular pairing, pretty much 99 times out of 100, it was going to say, we do not want white women marrying Native American men. However, in some states, they were more flexible in how they applied that. And if a white man married a Native American woman, they probably would not get prosecuted and probably no one would care, especially if since, especially during the Western frontier era, marrying a Native American woman might have gotten that white man kind of property rights to Native American lands, which definitely happened. So again, the point is there was an imbalance in how they were applied. They were not evenly applied to men and women. Sometimes they were flexible, given the circumstance. So let's kind of bring this up to more recent events and issues. Fears of interracial sex has fueled so many movements throughout U.S. history, from Jim Crow era lynchings, and some of you probably know that history. A lot of thousands of lynchings happened across the South. The most common excuse or reason for lynching was a white man, or excuse me, a black man, inappropriately touched or was in a legitimate, equal romance with a white woman and was killed because of it. To early silent film, which we're going to talk about soon, to the resistance of desegregation and the civil rights movement. Fears of interracial sex was a major, major reason why so many Southern whites resisted the civil rights movement. Again, they probably didn't teach that in high school because it's kind of forgotten by history, but it is, I think, a really important point. So let's unpack this a little bit. I'm sure a lot of you know about Emmett Till. He was a kind of pre-adolescent, I think 11 or 12-year-old boy who was from Chicago but was visiting his family in the South, and one day whistled at a white woman, maybe or not, we don't know. Again, there are conflicting accounts. There are some accounts say that he did not actually do this, but seemed to, find a white woman attractive and was summarily murdered. And this was, again, one of I think, a galvanizing moment in the civil rights movement, right? This is the publicity, national publicity over this horrible event was one of the things that kind of made the civil rights movement, that made a lot of Americans pay attention to it. And on the other side, resistance to the civil rights movement. There are a lot of reasons why white people in the South resist the civil rights movement, but this was one of them. Integrated schools, right? That was horrific to a lot of white people in the South because they didn't want their beautiful white daughters sitting next to black boys in school and possibly being friends and possibly dating them, right? So race mixing is communism. Again, it's funny now, but during the 1950s and 60s, that this was a major fear, right? That race mixing was going to lead to just the destruction of American democracy in a lot of people's minds. Let's get to movies now. And again, this is my point of this is kind of highlighting some of the ways that interracial sexuality is a powerful historical dynamic in American history that a lot of people don't know about. So in 1915, a movie was released called The Birth of a Nation. The Birth of a Nation was a silent film. It was about 3.5 hours long, which, it's mind-boggling today that somebody would watch a 3.5 hour long movie, period, but a silent 3.5 hour movie is mind-boggling to us. To this day, Birth of a Nation is one of the most commercially successful films in all of human history. In all of American history. When it came out, it was hugely popular. It was the first movie played in the White House for the president. It was the first kind of modern movie to put together a lot of basic film techniques that we now take for granted, and it played all across the country. What is The Birth of a Nation about? Well, the Birth of a Nation is basically a love letter to the KKK. The Birth of a Nation is a particular. It actually goes back to the whole lost cause thing that we talked about. I think the first or second class. It's a film about the lost cause. In The Birth of a Nation, the post-Civil War South is cast as this beleaguered, downtrodden kind of part of the country that is being oppressed by evil Northerners and black people who are getting political rights. It's almost like a superhero movie, right? It's like the KKK are the superheroes, and the villains are black people and Northern liberals who are trying to give black people rights, and the KKK come and save the day. And one of the most iconic scenes in the movie is where basically a character in the film gets the very idea for the KKK after he finds out that a woman that he cares about ended up committing suicide because a black man tried to rape her. Again, I'm laughing not because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's ridiculous and insane. But I want to play a clip from the movie just so you get a sense of how this movie was kind of representing interracial sexuality at that time. Now, I'm assuming that maybe all of you were very disturbed by what you just saw. But again, I'm showing it to you not to upset or make anybody angry. I'm showing it to you because this is, to this day, one of the most influential and important American movies ever of all time. This movie actually reinvigorated the KKK. The KKK had pretty much like kind of evaporated or disappeared by the early 20th century. And this film was so popular that the ranks of the KKK swelled in the millions. And again, this rhetoric of interracial sex, particularly black men with white women, was considered such a hot topic that it was really the centerpiece of this film, right? Um, okay, this is some ugly stuff. I'm going to say a few more things, and we're going to transition to some, I think, kind of a happy ending for this really ugly history. So things really change in a very particular year, 1967. Basically, there's a Supreme Court case in which an interracial couple um, was basically kicked out of Virginia for being in an interracial marriage, and they appealed to the ACLU, who basically filed a case for them that eventually made it in front of SCOTUS, and interracial marriage laws, miscegenation laws, were basically declared invalidated in 1967. 1967 is also the same year of a really, really important and influential American film, which I think was kind of capturing changing attitudes. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to play a video about the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which was, again, a really influential movie that came out really kind of like providentially almost the same year that the Supreme Court decided that interracial marriage laws were unconstitutional.
Starring Academy Award winner Spencer Tracy, Academy Award winner Sidney Poitier, Academy Award winner Katharine Hepburn. Introducing Katherine Houghton. 3 Academy Award winners and a bright young newcomer combine their talents in a love story of today.
I haven't even told you his name. Mom, it's John Wade Prentice. Isn't that a lovely name?
John Wade.
Joanna Prentice I'll be.
What the hell is going on here?
I love your daughter. There is nothing I wouldn't do to try to keep her as happy as she was the day I met her. But it seems to me, without your approval, we will make no sense at all. That is why I'm asking for the clearest possible statement of what your attitude is going to be.
I appreciate that, Doctor. It's almost in the form of an ultimatum.
Not quite, Mr. Drayton. All you have to say is goodbye.
Do you mean have we been to bed together? I don't mind your asking me that. We haven't. He wouldn't.
Until today, I would never have believed that I could say such a thing. But when she fights you, I'm going to be on her side.
But you don't own me. You can't tell me when or where I'm out of line, or try to get me to live my life according to your rules. Dad, you're my father. I'm your son. I love you. But you think of yourself as a colored man. I think of myself as a man.
That's the story of, that's the glory of love.
When this film came out, I will say a majority of Americans still oppose interracial relationships. And then again, there's survey data. I'm not going to show it to you, but there's survey data that backs this up. However, this was a hugely popular film. It was really successful at the box office. It got nominated for Best Picture, and it played all across the country, north, south, east, and west. And again, the success of this film, I think, is a really good indication that maybe Americans' attitudes, this is kind of at the height of the civil rights movement, Americans' attitudes on this issue were really shifting, and I think the financial success of this film is a good indication of that. Now I want to talk about Loving versus Virginia. Again, Loving, so, there's sometimes history does things that just seem like somebody, like a script writer came up with this. But so this man's last name, the white guy you see here, his last name was Loving. And, it's very traditionalist rural culture these two individuals came from. So when the two of them got married, the woman Mildred took his last name. Richard was the man's name. Yes, their last name was actually Loving. The Loving couple got married in Virginia. They got prosecuted for breaking the law. They moved to DC. They filed a brief with the ACLU, and eventually their case ended up overturning miscegenation laws across the country. So again, a happy ending to this really ugly story. Here's a little video explaining this a little further, and then we'll close out after that.
On July 11, 1958, at 2 a.m., a county sheriff entered the home of Virginia couple Richard and Mildred Loving, forced them out of their bed, and placed them under arrest. Their crime? Interracial marriage. This is the story of Loving versus Virginia and the landmark civil rights decision that would set an important precedent for marriage rights in America. Richard, who was white, and Mildred, who was Black and Native American, spent the early morning hours of July 11th in jail. They were tried and found guilty of violating Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a series of laws that made race mixing illegal. The Lovings were then given an ultimatum: spend 1 year in prison or leave the state of Virginia for 25 years. Frightened and unaware of their legal options, they moved to Washington, D.C., where their marriage was legal. They raised their 3 children in the nation's capital, financially strapped and isolated from friends and family. 5 years later, they returned to Virginia to visit Mildred's relatives, but were arrested for a second time for traveling together. Inspired by the burgeoning civil rights movement, Mildred decided to fight back. So in 1963, she wrote a letter to U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy asking for his advice. Kennedy referred the Lovings to the American Civil Liberties Union, who assigned their case to 2 young lawyers named Bernard Cohen and Philip Hirschkopf. Cohen and Hirschkopf took their appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that Virginia's anti-miscegenation laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed African Americans citizenship and all its privileges. The broad and sweeping language of the amendment, they argued, made no mention of interracial marriage, and thus guaranteed equal protection of a human being's right to marry. Attorneys from the state of Virginia argued that the state's rights should be prioritized over federal laws. But the argument didn't hold up. On June 12, 1967, the court unanimously struck down the Virginia marriage ban and overturned the Lovings' conviction. The court ruling reverberated across America, invalidating anti-miscegenation laws not only in Virginia, but in 16 other states that held them as well. After winning their case, the Lovings were finally free to do what they wanted to do all along. They lived quietly in Virginia as husband and wife until Richard's death in 1975.
Quick recap. Our topic was Strange Fruit, the Legacies of Racialized Slavery in American Life. We started by talking about the 1619 Project and some of the controversies around that. We did some basic race vocab. We looked at a very particular important moment in early American history when modern ideas or ideas of race that we recognize today start to develop. We looked at 2 case studies. We looked at jazz, and we looked at miscegenation laws and also how that issue was represented in media, both of which, jazz and miscegenation laws, I've made the argument, directly grew out of kind of this history of racialized slavery.
And as we always do, I want to close us out today with a post, a response. How did slavery continue to shape the U.S. after it ended? And I would like you to choose one of the 2 case studies we looked at. Choose to focus either on jazz or miscegenation laws, and then answer these 2 questions in response to whichever one of the 2 you've chosen. What was the most important takeaway or idea that you got from today's lesson? So what did you find particularly interesting, compelling, important, infuriating, whatever? And then briefly reflect on and react to how ideas and ideologies that directly emerge out of slavery shape your chosen topic. It's a little wordy. I'm realizing that now, but I think you get the idea. I was making the argument, after slavery ended, it continued to shape things, and I just want you to do a little bit of a reflection. What did you think of that? And with this specific issue, either jazz or miscegenation laws, how did that play out? Just a quick kind of summary and reflection. Thank you, and looking forward to reading your responses.